Hey everybody, it's Mr. Ruby. So this week we are looking at the synthesis essay. Once again, just as a reminder, the AP test this year will be a rhetorical analysis essay, but I wanted to make sure that we covered all three of the essay types because you will be seeing these again beyond this class, particularly those of you who are taking dual enrollment next semester, and obviously all of you who are going to college are going to have to be able to write all of these kinds of essays. So the synthesis essay is one that is it's essentially an argument, but you are provided with research that you are going to incorporate into your line of reasoning. So the skill involved obviously is going to build off of what you've done in argument, and now it's going to be about you sorting through. It's kind of like evidence gathering, but the evidence has been gathered for you, but sorting through the pertinent evidence in order to construct a strong argument. So I'm going to go through and talk about just some different things to keep in mind as you write this argument. But what you'll notice is that there's a tremendous amount of similarity between this and argument, because that's exactly what it is. It is sort of a marriage of the English argument essay and like a history DBQ. So, first of all, the synthesis essay, like the argument essay, is likely to offer one of three types of prompts. The prompt is either going to ask you to defend, challenge, or qualify a claim. So they'll just come right out and make a statement and then ask you to defend it, to agree with it, to challenge it, to disagree with it, or to qualify it, which is to complicate it, to add different qualifiers to it to sort of help narrow the focus of that argument. To develop a position on a given topic. So it's a little bit more nuanced than just defending or challenging. It's not going to give you a claim about a topic. It's just going to say, here's the topic. What do you think about it? And so you have a little bit more latitude in terms of how you develop your claim for that. Or evaluate several factors related to a topic. So, for example, there's one past prompt which is really interesting, which is about a thing called the locavore movement. And locavores are people who as communities as communities collectively decide that they are only going to purchase food that is grown within a pretty small radius of where they live. So, within 50 miles of where they live. And the idea behind that is that they believe that it is more sustainable economically, environmentally, that the food is healthier. And so on that particular prompt, it asks you, it pretty much says that it's given that you are going to be part of a locavore community, but it asks you what factors are the most important in terms of developing that community. So you kind of evaluate that, you sort of rank them, and then provide a defense for why those factors are important. It's not really about whether you agree or disagree with locavorism. It's about what are the factors that are most important. So there's a lot of different approaches to the synthesis essay in that the prompts are different, and you have to be very, very mindful of what the prompt's asking you to do. And just to kind of backtrack a little bit to the Unit 5 argument review, the Roosevelt patriotism essay, for some of you, some of the issues there were a struggle with sticking to what the prompt was asking you to do. For the most part, a lot of the reduced scores came as a result of just a real lack of evidence and examples and specificity in the argument. I did post some exemplars from our class, from our student writing yesterday, and I did that just to show you really what the expectation is for a passing score on this kind of test. So, but back to my original point, in that Roosevelt essay, it can be a little tricky because it does feel a little bit like you're supposed to be defending or challenging Roosevelt's ideas about what patriotism is, but the prompt specifically asks you to consider her ideas about patriotism, but then to develop your own claims about what it means to be a patriot. So you should not spend a tremendous amount of time talking about Roosevelt. It's okay to kind of anchor back to her and talk about some of the points she makes. But really, it's about developing your own notions of what patriotism is. And so for those of you who really connected to that part of the prompt, the main purpose of the prompt, which is to develop your own ideas, that's great. Like I said, I do understand why those of you who did write a lot about Roosevelt, some went so far as to kind of rhetorically analyze her writing. This is why it's so important to really be sure and confident as to what the writing task is. So, before you even begin writing, looking at the prompt and identifying what it is you're supposed to be doing, whether it's through highlighting verbs or underlining that writing task, I highly suggest you do that, because otherwise it's really easy to go off track. So like this last line says, annotate the prompt, underline its verbs, and be sure to know precisely what you're being asked to do. Okay. Write your thesis, and it should be clear, generally one sentence statement. This is just, not even on the essay. This is just as part of your notes, but this is going to be the anchor for your whole paper. Like, what is it that you are going to be proving throughout the course of the paper? So writing your thesis separate of the paper as you pre-write is a really good way to really make sure that you stay focused. So as I showed you last week, the mind map is a really good way to do that. You kind of put your thesis together in parts, and I have a sort of modified mind map for synthesis that is at the end of this slideshow. This thesis should express your opinion and show what you're going to argue, and then use the prompt to create your thesis. Stick to the limits of what you're being asked to do. Do not go rogue and wander away from the prompt. Now, one thing I will say about the synthesis prompts is there's a lot of prompts that are really, really good prompts. And what I mean by good is that they are things that are in a lot of your wheelhouses. Like, I think last year's was about public domain. And for those of you who are sort of like really politically charged and interested, it was a really interesting question about things like government overreach and whether or not the government has the right to step in and, legally confiscate property from a person. And that's huge. I mean, that's a really interesting and also provocative prompt, but it's also very easy to get caught up in the emotion of that because, politics are very emotional, and move away from what the prompt is specifically asking you to do. So that's one of those things that is really important to remember as you go through and look at these prompts, is that they are asking you to do something very specific. And going back to the argument essays, some of you did kind of like free form, quick write responses. Not acceptable. I mean, that's not what we're looking for. We are looking for highly structured, highly organized, highly logical essays in response. A couple of paragraphs just talking about how you feel about the prompt is not going to get you really anywhere, either on this AP test and especially in your college writing. The thing about writing, I think that a lot of people are starting to realize more, is that there's so many different occasions for writing and so many different environments for writing, and that because all of those occasions and environments are different, we have to approach them all differently as well. So there is a time and a place for reflective writing. There is a time and a place for free form, quick responses, just getting your ideas out on paper. But in formal written composition, it is highly structured, highly organized. It requires a tremendous amount of preparation. It requires a tremendous amount of thought and care, both in the writing process as well as the revision process. So it can be tedious, it can be arduous, but it is worthwhile, and it will pay off, in dividends down the road, especially for those of you who are going to be moving on beyond undergraduate school into graduate school, and you're going to be doing research and writing papers. So that's really important to keep in mind. Okay, quickly outline your main points. Again, I think the mind map is a really, really awesome way to put all of this together. But I know some of you like to use like a hierarchical outline format. Look, I don't require you to do any specific type of pre-writing. I just ask that you do pre-writing. Okay, I don't want you to do stream of consciousness. Just sit down and start writing, because you are more than likely going to paint yourself into a corner with your logic. So having a good plan, having a good roadmap up front is really important. Write out your outline, write out your pre-writing. Do not try to keep your outline in your head and just start writing. Okay. Especially in these circumstances when you are being asked to write under a time constraint, it's too much to juggle. Okay. You really need to be focused. I know that people are just like, oh, I can multitask. Now, multitasking for the most part is not as effective as you think it is. So having a plan, having organization is really important. One other thing, sorry, I know I'm kind of digressing a little bit, but one other thing about the AP test is, as you know, it's 45 minutes. And then there's 5 minutes to upload. And apparently what I just found out this morning is that basically they give you a 50-minute timer on the test. And that includes the writing time and the upload time. So you are responsible for keeping track of that timer. I know it gives you the option of turning the timer off. I don't suggest you do that. I know for some people it's like, oh, but my anxiety. It's like you're going to be a lot more anxious when the timer goes off and all of a sudden you have an incomplete essay. So you definitely want to make sure that you are being very attentive to that timer, and give yourself sufficient time to upload your documents. Okay, you need to use the minimum number of resources that your prompt requires. Typically, your prompt will specifically ask you to use 3 sources. Sometimes it'll ask for 4, but generally it'll ask you for 3, and they usually provide 6 or 7. So you don't have to use them all. You can use them all. But you don't have to. You only have to use whatever the minimum requirement is. You may, but you do not have to, and will not lose points for failing to do so. So if you don't use every prompt, it's okay. And citing all of the resources is not going to make your paper stronger. The quality and the logic and the depth of your argument is what's going to make your paper stronger. Don't merely adopt the arguments that you see in the resources. Consider yourself a writer who participates in a conversation with the sources. Your case should indicate critical thinking on your part, going beyond what the sources have said. Your own observations on and knowledge of the given subject are important too. It feels like the way you should organize your paper is, one paragraph is about source A, one paragraph is about source C, and one paragraph is about source G. That is the absolute wrong way to organize this paper. The way to organize, the way to organize this paper is to, in your pre-writing, develop your main points and use multiple sources per point to develop your claims. So, for example, in that locavore movement paper, if criteria A for your evaluation is starting a locavore community is really important, and the most important reason why is that it improves the health of the community by providing fresh food that is not treated or preserved. And you would go into those sources and you would find the sources, and there are multiple sources that support the idea of how fresh local food improves health. So you might have information or a quote from source A and source C that both support that point. So that's how you would organize that essay, is that you would develop your own points or your own claims and then use multiple sources per point to work through the argument. So a really good synthesis paper is going to have parenthetical references in every body paragraph, and it's going to have multiple parenthetical references from different sources. So if I'm looking at body paragraph 1, I want to see, source A, source C, source B, whatever. I want to see multiple sources per body paragraph. That's what's going to help you develop your really effective argument. But at the forefront of those arguments needs to be your thinking. Okay, it's not just a regurgitation or a summarization of those sources. You are just extracting, and making sure that you keep what you extract in context, information and evidence from those sources to support your argument. You can also identify your own observations and knowledge of the given subject. I know for that locavore paper a few years ago, I had a lot of students who were in ag, and they brought in a ton of really, really salient information that really helped their essays. And so, yeah, you're not limited to just the information you're provided. However, you do have to use a minimum number of sources, but you can pull in other outside information. You want to use both direct and indirect references to the sources you include. Don't just use direct quotes. You can also paraphrase, but you want to make sure that you use appropriate citations. Summarizing and paraphrasing requires skills beyond merely adding quotations from sources, which is why the AP requires you to do both. Being able to use both types of references demonstrates your skill as a writer. And I will drop some examples from past AP tests to show you what the really strong synthesis essays look like. Okay, so you only want to cite what's needed, no more, no less. If you only need a small phrase from a quotation, just use that, okay? Make sure that it's obviously within its original context. You don't want to twist somebody's words to have it mean the opposite of its intended meaning, because remember, the people who are reading this have also read all the sources. But if you just need like a little 3 or 4 word chunk out of there to really drive your point home, just use that. Don't, copy whole sentences or paragraphs if all that information isn't necessary. Generally speaking, use direct quotations when you cannot say it better in a paraphrase than the original. Don't awkwardly change the tense of a quote using parentheses in order to fit your prose. Use paraphrasing instead. I think that sometimes it's acceptable to bracket and change tenses, but the danger of this, of course, is that sometimes it can change the context. So you want to be really careful with that. When you paraphrase, be careful not to interpret. You want to shorten the work with precision, keeping the exact argument intact. Again, your readers know what these sources say. I've had students in the past that have sort of cherry-picked a quote out of one of the sources and used it as proof of the opposite argument it was intending to make. So, you're going to get really dinged on that, because that's not effective argument. That's a logical fallacy, and you want to avoid that. Don't misrepresent evidence to make it fit your thesis. You may even use some exact words or phrases from the original, but you'll be writing your own statement with citations, of course. And you want to end every paragraph with your own sentence, not with a quotation. The essay is yours, so your voice must dominate it. Even in your conclusion, if you use an engaging quotation, end with one more sentence of your own prose to signal your complete ownership of the essay. Yeah, even just from an aesthetic point of view, if a reader's putting eyes on your paper and they're seeing the last sentence or the last item in a paragraph is a parenthetical citation, that is not a good look. They want your writing to be really bookending each of those paragraphs. So, it's not to say that it's wrong, but it is not really mature writing to end with a quotation. Even when you include a quotation, you need to have something to say about it. So your last sentence should be your own. You want to use signal phrases to introduce your sources. We talked a lot about this with coherence. We talked a lot about this with transitions. Going back to that, to those notes that we took, or that I printed out for you before we left, looking at coherence and transitions is really important, because part of the logical line of reasoning of your paper is really constructed through the use of like things like signal phrases, of things like transitional phrases. So it's important to make sure that you are letting your reader know, what's coming and what you're going to be transitioning out of and into. So ideally identifying people by name and title, such as UCLA researcher Laurie Smith suggests, or according to Sam Jones, or director of the College Testing Board, so on and so forth. Another thing, a few of you, for whatever reason, in the last essay, decided that you were best friends with Eleanor Roosevelt and you thought that it was okay for you to just refer to her as Eleanor. Don't do that. You don't know these people. So when you are referring to a person in your text, unless you have a familiar relationship with them, you should be referring to them by their full name or last name only. Okay. Avoid saying things like "as source C suggests." So each of the sources will be labeled by the author's last name, and then also it will have source A, source B, source C, source D, whatever. When in the body of the paper, refer to the source by whoever's name is saying it. Okay, so if the person in source A, their last name is Thompson, refer to say "as Thompson suggests." If you want to have your parenthetical citations be source A, source B, source C, whatever, that's fine. You can choose either the last name or source A, B, C, whatever. But don't alternate between the two for parenthetical citations. Choose one, stick with it. So it is technically accurate to introduce or to use signal phrases. It's unsophisticated. Okay. The source A, B, and C, that's just a nice little convenient organizational thing that the College Board provides you. In most of your research writing, you are not going to label your sources A, B, and C. They're just doing that for this test. In most cases, you'll be able to cite the resources either by the author or its source and save the A, B, C stuff for your parenthetical citations. Honestly, I think the ABC stuff is great for pre-writing, but for the actual paper itself, I think, using the author's last name, which it's right there on the first page of the prompt, is going to be the most sophisticated way to present your paper. Provide analysis of your evidence. What do your quotations demonstrate, reveal, or suggest regarding your thesis? Don't ever put a quote and then not have something to say about it. Okay? Anytime you put a quotation, you got to have something to say about it. And what you say about it needs to connect back to supporting your argument. Okay. In your body paragraphs, it's a good idea to open with a claim directly related to your thesis. Okay. Use source materials to support it. So as I mentioned before, don't organize your body paragraphs by source. Organize them by your claims, and then use multiple sources to support those claims. Provide analysis of the quotation and paraphrase relative to your claim, and then link the material back to your thesis. These are some signal phrases that you can use to introduce counter argument. Things like although, despite, some may argue, X may claim. These are all good. I think these are from a book called They Say, I Say, which those of you who are taking dual enrollment next year will have access to. At some point in your college writing career, you will probably run across that book, and it's really, really helpful. And finally, here we have the mind map, but it is modified for the synthesis essay, and realistically, it's very, very similar. The big difference here are these two sort of lavender squares. Your evidence must come from a minimum of 3 sources. Do not write one paragraph per source. Your argument is central. Each paragraph should be supported by multiple sources. So these two squares here are the difference between the argument mind map and the synthesis mind map. So like I said, it's an argument. It's the same thing. There's just a little bit of a changes in terms of how you include your evidence. Your evidence is designed to illustrate your point. In some of your argument essays, if you look through my comments, I basically said, you're talking about a lot of theoretical stuff here. That's great, but I need evidence. I need historical evidence that's going to show me exactly what this looks like. I don't want hypothetical evidence. I don't want evidence that you were just like, let's just say this person behaves this way and therefore it proves my point. It's like, no, I want to see actual evidence that supports that. So I hope this helps. I think that the other sources that I've provided in this week's unit from the AP YouTube page as well as Fiveable are going to give you a deeper understanding of how to write this paper. So I ask that, like I said, if you get through this, you can upload any of your pre-writing into the designated assignment in this week's work. I also ask, the big thing is to do that AP classroom progress check. I've been really trying to be super thorough with my feedback and also answering questions as they come in. So there's more information coming with regards to the AP test. I hope that you're all, again, staying healthy and, kind of keeping abreast of all of this stuff, because I know how tempting it is to just sort of check out at this point in the year. But bear in mind that if you check out now, it's a much, much longer gap between now and the beginning of next year, and it's going to be a really, really hard restart. So, you want to keep your mind stimulated. You want to keep working. If you have any questions or you need to check in with me at any point, don't hesitate to drop me an email. So that was Synthesis. This is a good place to start. Beyond that, I would go into the AP YouTube page as well as the Fiveable stuff that I've posted. Next week, we'll return to rhetorical analysis, and we are going to just really hammer that all the way up to the day of the AP test. And we're going to spend the rest of our time just really talking about rhetorical analysis. Get those rhetorical analysis Bibles out. Make sure that you have them on hand. And that's all I have for you today. Okay, thanks, everybody.